Okay, so Liz and I are convening the novel methods and integration session. We have a great set of talks coming up for you. And just to motivate this a bit, emerging technologies, often let us explore new things, come up with new types of data that help us push science forward. And so that's the general theme of this session. And we're going to not say more, we're going to let the speakers say more.
Yeah, good morning. And a quick side note, we have our first notes appearing on the Delta doodles. So there is a small Sharpie to use right up here on the chair. Please use that one so it doesn't bleed through to the wall. And we look forward to more information showing up.
Okay, and with that, our first speaker is Maria Giorgio, who is speaking on using high-resolution remote sensing to capture organic carbon dynamics in Arctic river deltas. And with that, I'll let her take it away. She has 30 minutes. And I
Great.
Timer.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well? Awesome. Great. Well, this is a Landsat satellite image of the Yukon River Delta along the west coast of Alaska, showing how complex this delta is and how it really defines the optical properties of adjacent coastal Arctic waters. So with my presentation, I'll focus on these optical properties of coastal waters, linking to remote sensing of dissolved organic carbon dynamics in river deltas in the Arctic. Why the Arctic? Well, as was highlighted in the last Arctic report card, the Arctic continues to get warmer, wetter, less frozen, impacted by more extremes. We see stark differences in environmental responses across different regions. We see the Arctic tundra being transformed from a carbon sink to a carbon source. Such changes on Arctic land and hydrological processes have strong implications for biogeochemical fluxes to the coastal ocean. The big 6 Arctic rivers, you see here, Mackenzie, Yukon, Kolyma, Lena, Yenisei, Ob, deliver more than 18 teragrams of terrestrial dissolved organic carbon per year to the coastal ocean. Now, going back to measurements that started in the early 1930s, we've seen a long-term increase of freshwater flux into the Arctic Ocean, both in the Eurasian rivers as well as the North American rivers. As you see in this table, although all-time average from 1936 to 2021 annual discharge for the Yukon River was around 200 cubic kilometers, in 2020, this increased by 25%. And on average, across all Arctic rivers, we've seen more than 15% increase in annual discharge. Not only discharge has been changing, but the timing of some of these hydrological processes has been changing as well, especially the timing of the spring freshet. This time period when we have peak discharge, when snow on land and ice in rivers are melting, has been shifting earlier in spring. This is one of the major hydrological forcings in the coastal Arctic. In the big 6 Arctic rivers, up to 50% of the total dissolved organic carbon flux can occur just during these 3 to 4 weeks of the spring freshet. So to look at some of these processes, we've been having measurements in different river deltas, coastal systems across Alaska, from the Yukon River Delta and Norton Sound, all the way to the northmost tip of Alaska, Utqiagvik and the Elson Lagoon, as well as the North Slope of Alaska, the rivers there, and the coastal Beaufort Sea. Here is our study region in the Yukon River Delta. We had measurements in the Delta, as well as in the Norton Sound, all the way across transects to Nome, as well as measurements in the Northern Bering Sea in collaboration with NOAA Fisheries. And you see in this table some of our measurements. We've been collecting optical measurements to link to remotely sensed parameters, measurements collected from sensors on airborne and satellite platforms. And here you see multispectral, hyperspectral remote sensing reflectance, absorption, scattering, fluorescence, but also biogeochemical measurements, different carbon pools, molecular tracers. And we've also been doing carbon transformation experiments in the lab to better quantify transformation rates, both for physical and biological processes. And we've had these measurements in different years, but also maybe more important, different times on the hydrograph, both around the spring freshet when you have peak discharge, but also later in summer when we have significantly lower discharge. So how do these changing hydrological forcings impact organic carbon dynamics in these coastal waters? First, I will show you some results from our field measurements, and then I will transition to remote sensing. Here, you see results from our measurements during the spring freshet in 2019. This is a transect that goes all the way from Nome to the Yukon River Delta. And what I'm showing here is fluorescence of organic matter. And you see that during the spring freshet, the Yukon River plume, this really strongly fluorescent material, extends more than 50 kilometers from the shoreline. Now, if you look at the absorption of this material and dissolved organic carbon concentrations versus salinity, you see we have conservative mixing with salinity, suggesting that during the spring freshet, the Yukon River acts more like a pipe that exports this strongly fluorescent, strongly absorbing carbon-rich material to the coastal Arctic Ocean. But then a very different picture later in summer. These are measurements now we had in 2018, late summer, and you see, first of all, absorption is lower, dissolved organic carbon concentration is lower, but also there is no conservative mixing with salinity. Now we see some sinks, some losses, indicating transformations within the lower river and the delta. To look a little bit more closely at this DOM mixing behavior across the salinity gradient, here you see results from different years during the spring freshet and later in summer. We have measurements during the spring freshet in 2019, as well as 2023, shown by the red and orange symbols here, as well as measurements later in summer in 2018 and 2022, shown by the blue and green symbols here. And I'm showing CDOM absorption, the dissolved organic carbon concentration versus salinity, but also some additional optical parameters that give us more information about the quality of this organic carbon. You see the fluorescence of humic material, the ratio of humic versus protein fluorescence in dissolved organic matter. You also see the absorption spectral slope that gives us information on the spectral shape of absorption, as well as the DOC-specific CDOM absorption. And when you look at these results, you see that, first of all, the mixing behavior varies seasonally in the Yukon River, but also during the spring freshet, we have this enrichment of strongly absorbing, carbon-rich, humic, more higher molecular weight material of higher aromaticity. I need to mention that these two parameters, especially the slope and the DOC-specific CDOM absorption, are very good indicators of molecular weight and aromaticity in dissolved organic matter, with the slope being lower and the DOC-specific CDOM absorption being higher for more aromatic, more humic dissolved organic matter. So having this slope lower here during the spring freshet and the DOC-specific CDOM absorption higher indicates that we have strongly humic, strongly aromatic, high molecular weight dissolved organic matter. But then you see that we have a shift to less aromatic, more protein-like, less absorbing, lower molecular weight material later in summer, and also across higher salinity environments, across the salinity gradient. These results from the optical measurements are really consistent with measurements that we had from chemical analysis, ultra-high resolution mass spectrometry. These results were published in a paper by Kellerman et al. 2023, where we showed that in late summer, indeed, you have this aliphatic enrichment, more nitrogen-containing compounds, and this is also the case across the salinity gradient. So these gradients here indicate transformation, and with previous incubation experiments, we found that the Yukon River DOM is strongly susceptible to photochemical degradation, which actually in turn converts this material to more bioavailable organic matter. Here you see results from photobleaching experiments we had on DOM collected from the Yukon River mouth, both in late summer, late August of 2022, shown by the orange symbols here, as well as in early June, spring freshet of 2023, shown by the blue symbols. And you see that with cumulative exposure, we have a decrease in the serum absorption, an increase in the slope, and a decrease in the DOC-specific serum absorption. That indicates conversion of this more humic-like material to less humic material. When you look at the results normalized to initial conditions, we see that we have very similar rates, actually, in this photochemical degradation during these very different time periods. We also see that we have a stronger change in the quality of the dissolved organic matter, but not a lot of change in the amount, the concentration of the dissolved organic carbon in the system. So the quality is changing significantly during photochemical degradation. And to look a little bit more closely at how the chemical structure changes with photo exposure, we looked at results from fluorescence. With fluorescence, we measured the emission excitation matrices, and running parallel factor analysis, we found that this organic matter is characterized mostly by 6 major fluorescent components. 3 components are more characteristic of humic-like material, and I'm showing this with the red, orange, yellow colors. We had a component that is typical of degraded humic, shown by the light yellow here, and then 2 components associate more with protein-like material, shown by the green and blue. And you see that during these photoblitzing experiments, we found that the cumulative exposure, we have a photodegradation of the more humic-like dissolved organic matter and a relative increase in the protein-like material. These results from the photoblitzing experiments were very similar to measurements we had in the field. Now you see samples we collected from the field across the salinity gradient, the same components here, and you see a transition from more humic DOM further upstream to more protein-like dissolved organic matter across the salinity gradient, higher salinities in the coastal ocean in the river plumes. These results from photoblitzing experiments, from field observations, are important to be able to understand some of these processes and inform parameterizations in coupled physical biogeochemical models. But if you look at the map here, you see that the spatial and temporal coverage of field observations is actually quite limited. Satellite observations from space can really improve the spatial and temporal coverage and provide information at the larger ecosystem scale, especially across coastlines that are quite challenging to access, like what we have in the coastal Arctic. To look at some of these processes from space, we used Sentinel-3 ALCHI satellite imagery because it provides a really nice combination of spatial and temporal resolution, spatial resolution of 300 meters and daily revisit. We wanted to look at both the serum absorption magnitude in these coastal waters, but also the absorption spectral slope, this parameter that gives us indications about the quality of dissolved organic matter. And we looked at several algorithms, and we found the best performance for an algorithm we previously published for more turbid systems, a multispectral, multiple linear regression approach that was optimized here for Yukon, and it was blended with Alcantara under really high turbid conditions. For the DOC concentration, we didn't just relate to the absorption of this dissolved organic matter in the water, but we used a very strong relationship between the DOC-specific serum absorption and the absorption spectral slope, 2 parameters that really depend on the quality of DOM. And previous studies shown that this relationship is really strong across actually a range of coastal environments. And you see here the validation of the algorithms. Satellite versus in situ measurements of serum absorption, the absorption spectral slope, and the dissolved organic carbon concentration, really good agreement across a wide range of conditions. And if you look at this at the spatial domain, now you see the good agreement across the salinity gradient. I'm showing here 8-day ALCHI composites for the spring freshet of 2019, and superimposed with the circles, you see our in situ measurements. Really good agreement. Also, later in June, you don't even see some of the circles here, which is exactly what we want to have when we compare in situ with satellite. And these are results for the spring freshet in 2022. Later, in June, later in summer, late August, early September, and these are results for the spring freshet in 2023. So having these algorithms, now we're able to apply the satellite retrievals to more than 5 years of satellite observations from MOLTI going from 2017 to 2023. And I'm going to show here an animation showing dissolved organic carbon concentrations across this entire system. And now you see the system alive. You see this export of carbon from the land to the ocean. You see how it looks from space. You see the seasonal variability, interannual variability. You also see the distinct plumes we have from the south, middle, north mouths of the river delta. We see also some consistent seasonal patterns. Maximum export of dissolved organic carbon right after the spring freshet, then a decrease in June, July, and then some secondary plumes in late summer associated with secondary peaks in discharge. Not only we can see the magnitude, the amount of this dissolved organic carbon, but applying the retrievals for the sedum absorption spectral slope, now we can see the change in the quality of this organic matter. You see that the Yukon River really delivers this not only strongly absorbing and carbon rich, but also strongly humic, strongly aromatic dissolved organic matter, particularly during the spring freshet. Capturing these seasonal transitions in different years from the ground is extremely challenging. In the coastal Arctic, we can only do this to some extent with collaborations with local communities. And as part of this project, we've been collaborating with the Alakanuk Village, the Alakanuk Tribal Council, the IGAP Environmental Department at the Village of Alakanuk, as well as the Lower Yukon School District. We've been working with high school students who have been collecting samples for us daily around the time of the spring freshet in June, and then weekly in July and August. Here you see Kira and Theo, 2 students who worked with us during several summers, actually. And here I'm going to show you the results from their measurements during the summers of 2022 and 2023. Amazing time series we collected that show these seasonal changes in dissolved organic carbon, but also the quality of dissolved organic matter in this system in response to changes in discharge. These 2 years were quite different. Discharge and peak discharge, the spring freshet in 2022 happened early. In 2023 happened 1 week later, and it was significantly more abrupt. And these measurements showed that during the early freshet in 2022, we actually had higher dissolved organic carbon in the system, but also more humic, more aromatic dissolved organic matter. But by midsummer, the quality and the amount of the Yukon DOC was quite similar between these very different years. We also see that the strongest gradients in dissolved organic carbon occur within just these 3 to 4 weeks from the spring freshet. Having this time series is great, but we only have this time series at this one location in the Alakanuk River, where these samples were collected. With satellite observations, we can see what happens further downstream, and we can actually capture some of these plumes at the entire ecosystem scale. And what you see here is, again, the sedum absorption, the time series collected with the field observations, the blue symbols here with the green circles. You can see results from Olchi, right at the South River mouth here. And you see that Olchi really nicely captured the impact of the early spring freshet in 2022. It also captured this really strong transition within the first 3 to 4 weeks from the spring freshet, and the secondary peaks later in summer associated with secondary peaks in discharge. And the same in 2023, captured the peak in discharge in dissolved organic carbon, as well as the secondary peak later in summer. We also see some differences between the time series because of all these processes between these 2 end members. Remember, during the spring freshet, we have this strong conservative mixing with salinity. But also later in summer, we see that we have some additional processes, including retention and additional organic carbon sources in nearshore waters from biological activities as well as associated with some sediment suspension. Having these observations in large Arctic rivers is really important to capture the hydrological, biogeochemical connectivity between terrestrial aquatic ecosystems in the coastal Arctic. However, more than 40% of riverine discharge to the Arctic Ocean originates from smaller rivers, such as the Colville River system along the North Slope of Alaska. So we have been having measurements in this environment as well. Here you see the North Slope of Alaska. 3 major river systems contribute carbon and nutrients to this coastal environment. Colville is the largest one that flows into the Harrison Bay and a little bit to the Simpson Lagoon. And then you have Kuparuk and Sagavanriktok, or SAG, that flow into the Simpson Lagoon, Prudhoe Bay, and Stephenson Sound. To look at carbon dynamics in this system, we use Sentinel-3 OLCI, 300-meter resolution, but because we also wanted to look at some processes at finer spatial scale, we used MSI Sentinel-2 imagery at 60-meter resolution, as well as Airborne Avery-St. imagery at 5-meter resolution. For the algorithms of CDOM absorption and the absorption spectral slope, again, we used the multispectral multiple linear regression approach optimized here for the North Slope of Alaska. And for the DOC algorithms, again, this very strong relationship between the slope and the DOC-specific CDOM absorption. And you see validation worked really well across a wide range of conditions. This is the comparison across the spatial domain. With the circles you see are in situ measurements collected in August 20 to 24, 2022. And here you see the OLCI overpass on August 24. And you see very good agreement for the absorption at 300 nanometers. And here are the comparisons for the slope. And this is comparisons for the dissolved organic carbon concentration. Now, on the same day, we didn't only have an overpass from OLCI, we also had an overpass from MSI at 60-meter resolution. And you see the really good agreement between these 2 different sensors, 2 platforms, which makes us confident that the algorithms really work across different sensors. This is another day when we had a comparison with OLCI and MSI on the same day, relatively clear sky, not that many clouds around this area, which is very rare. And you see here agreement for dissolved organic matter absorption, the slope, and the dissolved organic carbon concentration. Both MSI and OLCI captured this very strong nearshore to offshore gradient with higher absorption by dissolved organic matter, lower absorption spectral slope, and higher dissolved organic carbon concentrations in the very nearshore waters, also within the barrier islands, the lagoons, and at the river mouths. So then we use these algorithms to look at temporal and spatial dynamics along this coastline. Here I'm showing temporal dynamics in dissolved organic carbon concentration. You see OLCI, 8-day composite, dissolved organic carbon concentration averaged over these spatial domains from its river mouth going out to 10 kilometers offshore. And you see these for different years, 2020, 21, 2022, all the way from June to August, compared with daily riverine discharge. And you see that regardless of the peak in discharge, you see that the highest DOC concentrations occur right after the spring freshet. And then you see some additional peaks later in summer associated with secondary peaks in discharge. You also see interannual differences in peak discharge mirrored in these dissolved organic carbon concentrations. For example, look at the results here for Kuparuk. We have a decline in the spring freshet from 2020, 2022, 2021, 2022, and this is mirrored in the dissolved organic carbon concentrations. We also see more variability in discharge in the Sag River system, corresponding to more variability in dissolved organic carbon concentrations. How about the quality of this material? Well, the opposite pattern here in the slope, indicating that this material exported from all rivers is strongly humic, strongly aromatic, and then an increase in the slope later in summer, indicating intense transformations. And actually, you see that the widest range in the absorption spectral slope occurs in the Kuparuk River, indicating that we have very strong transformations in the Simpson Lagoon, an area where we have longer residence times. Looking at Spatial dynamics. Here I'm showing latitudinal transects from the mouth of each one of these rivers all the way out to more than 100 kilometers offshore. This is for Colville, Cuparuk, and Sag, different years corresponding to different discharge conditions. And you see that we have the strongest DOC near the river mouths, but then you also see that there is a very strong decline in dissolved organic carbon by 70 to 80% within 50 kilometers offshore. You notice that the strongest gradients actually occur within these gray shaded areas that indicate the location of the lagoons within the barrier islands, suggesting that these systems are quite important for carbon, not only because you can have accumulation of dissolved organic carbon there, but also because you can have strong flocculation as well as carbon burial. Offshore Colville, you see that there is a more gradual decrease in DOC because we have more mixing with the open ocean environment. And then you notice here for the Sag River offshore, you see some transient peaks in dissolved organic carbon concentration, indicating that we have a strong influence from the Mackenzie, the river plume. Under certain conditions, the Mackenzie river plume can extend westward, having a significant impact on the biogeochemistry of the central Beaufort Sea, especially during years when we have really strong discharge. Airborne imagery allows us to look at some of these processes at much finer spatial scale. And we were very lucky to have 27 overpasses from Avis and G as part of NASA's Above Field Campaign program in August 2022. And I'm gonna show here some results for the western domain of our study region, influenced mostly by Colville River. Here you see the Colville River plume flowing also into the Simpson Lagoon. And these are comparisons now between Avis and G, early August 2022. On the same day, actually, we were able to have an overpass from MSI Sentinel-2, and you see, we're amazed to see this really good agreement between these very different satellite platforms. Both MSI and Avis and G show that you have this strong accumulation of dissolved organic carbon within the barrier islands. Higher DOC here in the Simpson Lagoon compared to what's happening here on the northwest domain, where we have more mixing of the carbon-rich material exported from the Colville River with the open ocean environment. And then we have really good agreement within the inland ponds and smaller river tributaries with Avis and G providing additional information, finer scale gradients within these very near shore environments. And then we were comparing what happens in this area influenced mostly by the Colville River plume with this area here within the Simpson Lagoon, the influence from the Cuparuk River. Here you see stark differences in dissolved organic carbon concentrations within the Simpson Lagoon, within the barrier islands, and outside the barrier islands. We have twice as high dissolved organic carbon concentrations in the Simpson Lagoon compared to what happens in the Harrison Bay, where we have the influence from the eastern Colville River mouth. And if you zoom in here, you really can capture this influence of the carbon plumes from the Cuparuk distributaries influencing carbon dynamics in the system. And these finer spatial resolution observations really can capture this connectivity you see here between the land and the ocean in the Arctic. Now we are integrating these observations from field measurements, satellite retrievals into coupled physical biogeochemical models to better understand the impact of these biogeochemical fluxes to ecological, biological processes in the coastal Arctic. And if you would like to learn more about this project, you can visit our website here. Before I finish, I would like to mention that if you're interested in contributing to this improved understanding of carbon fluxes, carbon dynamics in the coastal Arctic, and if you would like to participate in field work in the North Slope of Alaska, NASA has this opportunity, a new adventure suborbital mission that's called FORTE, Frontlines for Rapidly Transforming Ecosystems. This is a new adventure suborbital mission that will integrate observations from airborne sensors, satellites, research vessels, smaller boats, drones, to capture these complex processes along this beautiful but also very dynamic coastline. We have the funding, we have the resources, we have the leadership and management team, and NASA has a solicitation to select the science team for Forte. This is the QR code to learn more about the solicitation, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me and also contact our program scientist, Dr. Laura Lorenzoni. Thank you so much.